So good morning, everyone. Welcome to our virtual symposium on innovation and collaboration to combat gender-based violence, inclusive voices, and collective power. Today, we are co-hosting this webinar with the Canadian Network for the Prevention of Elder Abuse, as well as Women Act. Before we begin our proceedings, I would like to acknowledge that today we gather on the traditional territory of a number of First Nations. We acknowledge their stewardship of this land throughout the ages and seek a new relationship with the original peoples of this land, one that is based in honor and deep respect. I'd now like to introduce Debra Sayewich, who will open our conference. Debra has lived experience of 30 plus years in management and business development and has inspired many collaborative and innovative partnerships. Debra has been providing positive results, positive oriented facilitation, including communication. She believes every conversation starts with good listening. A great reputation for implementing innovative solutions. Volunteering for over 15 plus years, she was a past co-chair for the Prevention of Elder Abuse Network in York Region. Debra is excited to share with you that she has recently launched OAKS, the Older Adults Knowledge Sharing. Like a mighty oak tree, OAKS is planting the seed of empowerment, education, wisdom, and sharing. Debra is a member of the Wasauksing First Nation on the beautiful shores of Georgian Bay. She resides in Richmond Hill with her spouse of over 40 years. She truly believes that we enter this world in a good way, to live each day to the fullest. Her vision is to be part of change, building relationships with respect, trust, and commitment. It takes a community to support an individual. So I'm now going to turn it over to Debra to provide opening remarks.
Thank you, Brianne. Honey, and welcome to Innovation and Collaboration to Combat Gender-Based Violence, Inclusive Voices, Collective Power. I come today from the meeting place of two treaties, the lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation and those of the First Nations of the Williams Treaty. A traditional meeting and gathering place for many of our Indigenous people. Before I came to the screen this morning, I went out with prayer and laid sama tobacco. So we are all here in a good way, in good spirit. While we meet today on this virtual platform, we come together in unity, in harmony, and we speak as one to listen to what is shared. We recognize there are many pathways on our journey of life for the young, our youth, our elders, and everyone in between. As an Indigenous Kwai and sitting in circle with many community members across this land we call Turtle Island, my ask is, may we listen not only to the words, but to the pause. Our moments of silence are okay. Believe what is shared. I ask that you not prejudge or assume. You do not know how they are feeling. We need to let them know that it's not their fault. And fortunately, in our remote and rural communities, we know that our women and our gender diverse experience higher statistics with gender-based violence. How can I help? How can you help? Be there in the moment. There's not a cookie cutter approach. There's not an easy fix. We need to know there is a safe space, a space where women and gender diverse people can go. We need to be seen, to be vocal when voting for people in power. Do you ask, what are they going to do to combat gender-based violence? equality for all women. Be strong with your voice. Your voice matters for those who need our support. Listen, listen, listen. Children, our future generations, many have witnessed GBV in their home, and they are also victims. Our youth living in rural and urban setting need the support where they can access resource and services in their area, the need in their area. Ask, how can I help? Don't assume. Be respectful of the decision. We're here to support. We come together today in a good way, and we all want to leave this world in a good way. How we live our ditto in between is up to you. I believe that I'm here to make a difference. Moving forward with the support of the EAPO, Oaks was nurtured with a vision that I had shared. With my co-chair and friendship of Monica, we started with a mission, planting the seeds of empowerment, education, wisdom, and sharing. A vision that together we are the branches creating a strong foundation. Like the branches of the mighty oak tree, we at Oaks will do our best to provide empowerment without boundaries. We come together today in a good way, and I will keep saying in a good way, living a good life in peace and harmony with all the creation. Wisdom, love, respect, bravery, honesty, humility, and trust. Menu, it is good. Today, we are in balance. Our words are in alignment with what we do. Jimigach, and blessings for a beautiful day.
Thank you so much, Debra, for those inspiring words to guide us through our day today, and the wisdom and knowledge that will be shared throughout with our speakers. And we're here to learn and to come together to make a difference. So thank you so much for joining and providing that nice welcome to open up our conference. Good inspiring words. Miigwech. I would just like to provide some opening remarks from Elder Abuse Prevention Ontario. So my name is Rayanne Rideout, and I'm the Director of Strategic Partnerships. On behalf of the board and staff, it is my distinct pleasure to welcome you this morning, our delegates, our distinguished speakers, and subject matter experts, our community partners, our supporters, and especially our team of dynamic ASL interpreters who are joined throughout the day today. This is our fourth event in a series of conferences that we've been hosting this past year. And this year for this session, we are so pleased to host and collaborate with the Canadian Network for the Prevention of Elder Abuse and Women Act. We've done this event in collaboration. We thank them for their collaborative spirit and organizing this gender-based violence symposium, and for the resources and offerings that they have provided. So together, we hope that you will enjoy this exciting and interactive session that we have hosted for you today. This event is also being hosted to recognize the 16 days of activism against gender-based violence, to raise awareness and take action against gender-based violence to create a positive change. The 2023 theme this year is Listen, Learn, and Act, and names the keynotes of tackling gender-based violence. We encourage everyone to educate themselves about gender-based violence, to recognize it, to prevent it, and most importantly, know what actions we can take and apply in our daily lives to call out the violence directed against women, girls, to us LGBTQI+ individuals. Like elder abuse, gender-based violence is complex, pervasive, multifaceted issue, often with deadly consequences. It is deeply rooted in human rights violations, and like elder abuse, can take many insidious forms. Everyone has the right to live free from violence and abuse. Yet, as you will hear today, the statistics being reported tells a very different story. Some of the information you will hear may be difficult to process. Those statistics are jarring, but being effective in our rules with human services means acknowledging what is actually happening. Time and again, we hear growing evidence for applying a preventive lens to our work, whether in the development of policies, legislation, or the delivery of services and programs. We can facilitate positive outcomes. To do this effectively, we must, through forums like this, harness our cumulative knowledge and expertise and experiences to craft and implement critical solutions to the problem. That knowledge is a catalyst for social change, because the better informed we are, the more effectively we can reverse those disturbing trends of violence against women. The Canadian National Action Plan to End Gender-Based Violence consists of 5 pillars, which we will learn more about today. The plan is reflective of perspectives shared by victims, survivors, service providers, and frontline responders, as well as advocates and academics, all of us calling for action to stave off the loss of lives of individuals because of their gender identity. Without further delay, thank you for your commitment towards helping stop the violence against women, children that are experiencing gender-based violence. I would now like to take the opportunity to give you a little bit of logistics before I introduce our keynote speaker today. Many of you may not have used FeedLoop before, so we are bringing this platform to you to provide more options for networking with individuals that are online today, to interact with our speakers who are here today. It is an interactive forum, and I will go over some of those logistics to provide you with that experience. So as many of other sessions we've hosted, all microphones will be muted because we have so many people online. However, for communication, there are several options that you can interact with other participants. As many of you have already discovered, there's a little message box. If you'll see a little bubble in the top right-hand screen where you can start a chat, and everyone can see that or comment on your posts that you have. Also, during our session now, you can also put in at the bottom, there's a chat box where you can make comments as well. And when we do our presentations for the concurrent sessions and the panel, and after our keynote, you can put a question for the speakers in the Q&A box. At the end of the sessions, we will ask those questions to the speaker on your behalf and for them to address it. As you're aware, we have our interpreters with us today, and you can make them on your screen a little larger if you choose. You can either pull the screen across to make the images larger between the PowerPoint and the speakers, or you can change the speaker view according to what your own needs are. You also have the ability to open or enable closed captioning on your own screen as well, or disable, depending on what your needs are. Other accessibility features you will see also on the top right-hand screen. You'll see a little man here. If you click on that little guy, you will have a lot of options and features to change the screen to meet your visual needs, or in terms of size, font size, etc. So there's lots of features there. You can choose also to meet your needs. Lastly, evaluation, everyone's favorite. We do want to hear back from you about the event today. We know some people maybe only be able to stay partly through the session, maybe not stay all day. We still do appreciate your feedback on the parts of the program that you are able to attend. We will be sending an email after the event today, as well as a follow-up reminder tomorrow with a link to SurveyMonkey to answer a few questions to get your feedback and also provide ideas for future events based off today's session. You'll also find the survey link in the lobby provided. You will see in the lobby that there's also, when you're on breaks, that you can go back and look. There's other suggestions and features of FeedLoop that you might have questions about. That is there, as well as the link to the survey. We are recording all the sessions today, so please give us 1 to 2 days to upload that to our websites. It'll be on Elder Abuse Prevention Ontario and the Canadian Network's website within either this week or next week, based on time. And just lastly, just building on that networking piece, I just want to, when we go into breaks, you will be able to do further networking with other colleagues. So you can search individual by name if you know the individual's person's name. And you can filter as well. You can see if you want to talk to a speaker or the attendees. Those are listed under the filter if there's specific persons that you want to network with. And you can also, if you click on the individual's name, you can either do a private chat, which you see as down here says start a chat. Those are private. We don't see any of those conversations that happen. Or you could do a video chat. You have that option as well. So you can, make further partnerships or collaborations during the sessions today. You can also update your account. So account meaning your profile. So if you want to do an image, or if you have a website or file, that you can upload that in your own profile settings. So if someone clicks on your name, they can find further information about you. So if you have something you want to share, or we are more than happy to do that on your own profile for people to get connected. And also just want to say that many people have looked at the program, but we do have 2 concurrent sessions today. One after the keynote at 12:15 to 1, and then the other one from 2:40 to 3:25. You'll be able to choose from 3 of the presentations in each of those sessions. So this is in the first session after. So there's 3 sessions. You can choose which one you would like to attend. If you're finding one that you would like to switch, you can just log out of that and go to the next one. It might take a couple seconds just to switch programs for your computer, but you can toggle in between the different sessions that you want. Again, during the breaks, we encourage you to network, but we are also put in a few videos if you want to watch. They're short, believe up to maybe 2 minutes, I think is the longest. So we've put different videos in the different break sessions if you want to view those from Women Act, as well as the Elder Abuse Prevention Ontario. We have videos that we're showing that was done in collaboration with the Canadian Network for the Prevention of Elder Abuse. So that brings us to our keynote presentation. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Myrna Dawson. Myrna is a professor of sociology and research leadership chair at the College of Social and Applied Human Services at the University of Guelph. She's a founder and director of the Center for the Study of Social and Legal Responses to Violence and the Canadian Femicide Observatory for Justice and Accountability. Her research examines responses to violence against women and children. She's the co-founder and co-director of the Canadian Domestic Homicide Prevention Initiative and Vulnerable Populations, and a former Canadian research chair in public policy and criminal justice. She has spent over 2 decades researching violence prevention with an emphasis on violence against women, children, femicide, and filicide. I've had the opportunity of working with Myrna in the past, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce Myrna, and she will provide our keynote speaker. So thank you so much, Myrna, for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Leanne. And I hope everyone can hear me well. If not, please let the organizers know. Thank you for the invitation to be part of this special event. It's an honor and a privilege to have the opportunity to join everyone this morning. I want to begin by recognizing that I am speaking to you from Guelph, Ontario, which is situated on the treaty lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit and the Dish with One Spoon Wampum. I am committed to building a relationship with First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples who live and work in the city of Guelph, and acknowledge my responsibility to future generations, non-human beings, the land, and the water. I also acknowledge my commitment and responsibility to preventing further violence against Indigenous women and girls and their communities. I want to begin today by underscoring, as many of you know, that when I and others speak about femicide, we emphasize that these acts are just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to gender-based violence. When we use the term femicide, it's meant to be a social indicator or a barometer of sorts for those broader experiences that are of violence against women and girls and gender-based violence. In this same way, my talk today uses femicide as an example of how members of the public, and especially our governments and our leaders, if willing, could play a much more active role in determining society's ability and capacity to prevent male violence against women and girls and gender-based violence. It has been argued that femicide has not received the attention it should, in part because it affects only half the world's populations, women and girls. If this argument is even a little bit true, this belief is both short-sighted and incorrect. Although I would argue that to care about women and girls should be enough to believe in the urgency of femicide prevention. However, if not to some, it is important to remind ourselves, and mostly others, that femicide affects all of us, all our communities, all our countries. As argued by Valerie Hudson and her colleagues in their 2012 book, Sex and World Peace, the security of women is a vital factor in the overall security of countries, including as it pertains to conflict and war, which is an argument particularly relevant in our world today. And the security of women requires several conditions, not the least of which is living a life free of violence. However, the world has become less secure for women and girls. For example, just last week, many of you have probably heard that a global United Nations report documented that the number of sex or gender-related killings of women and girls was higher in 2022 than in the past 2 decades. This is despite overall declines in homicide more generally, and the much effort that has been expended, at least on paper, to prevent such killings. Today then, using femicide as a case study, I want to speak about what countries, and especially governments at all levels, can do to prevent femicide, which in turn will reduce other forms of violence against women and girls and gender-based violence. Every now and then I look to the side of the screen to make sure that the interpreter hasn't fallen off her chair. So good so far. Today then, I will argue that there are 3 key roles, which are the core responsibilities of our governments, and they must lead in these areas to effectively prevent femicide. The first is to recognize the severity of the problem and call it what it is. Femicide, or feminicide, the latter term used in some countries and world regions. We use the hashtag #CallItFemicide in our social media education and public awareness efforts, a hashtag that is gaining ground globally. We do so to draw attention to the volumes of global research, including our own and others in Canada, that has identified numerous sex or gender-related motives and indicators which clearly underscore the distinct nature of femicide and how it differs from other types of homicide. Some of these have been identified in a recently released statistical framework for identifying femicide released by the United Nations. So the first key role of our government is to lead in the recognition of femicide. Why is this important? How we respond to violence in our communities and in society is a product of our culture and its values. How we respond to survivors or victims and perpetrators of violence, and how our responses vary depending on the characteristics of those involved, is also a product of our culture and its values. These values are represented and reflected back to us by the legislations, policies, and programs that our governments prioritize and support. These values are represented and reflected back to us by the language and the content of these legislations, policies, and programs, specifically in terms of whom or what groups are prioritized as worthy of attention. More importantly, whom or what groups of women and girls remain invisible. In the past several decades, in many countries, numerous initiatives have targeted violence experienced by women and girls and gender-based violence, producing important legal, social, and cultural transformations, including the acknowledgement that this form of violence is both a public health and human rights crisis. Sorry. These advances occurred because some of those individuals who were tasked with prioritizing and designing legislations and policy finally began to recognize the seriousness of femicide and the need for a holistic, whole-of-sector response that addresses the root causes, including sex and gender inequality, misogyny, and patriarchal social structures that continue to see women as property or objects of men and male-dominated society. In large part, these advances were due to the tireless efforts of feminists and grassroots movements across the world, including in Canada, many of whom may be here today, and I salute you. In Canada, the heyday for progress was in the mid-1990s. At that time, Canada was seen as a leader, being one of the earliest countries to adopt numerous policy measures in the mid-1980s. Canada also had a worldwide reputation for its innovative programs in police training and specialized research. However, these activities have since leveled off considerably, and arguably, it has been a slow and uphill climb since then. For example, in 2019, before the pandemic, our current Canadian responses to male violence against women and girls were described by the United Nations Special Rapporteur as, and I quote, mainly project-oriented, focusing on specific areas, and lacking a human rights-based holistic legal framework and comparable data collection. She further argued that there was a significant need for a more comprehensive national action plan that women's organizations in Canada have been demanding for decades. We will remain cautiously hopeful that this will be achieved with the new strategy. And this remains crucial, requiring federal leadership more than ever. The situation is more urgent due to some degree by the impacts of COVID, which are still being felt and will be felt for some time to come. Globally and in Canada, rates of many forms of violence against women and girls have remained persistently stable, as many of you know, over past decades. And they've also increased during the pandemic. For example, in this chart, which was included in our most recent report, we see that the lowest number of killings was documented in 2019, pre-COVID-19. As shown, there have been gradual increases in the number of victims in each of the years following. Looking at the first column of numbers, more specifically, compared to 2019, 2020 saw a 16% increase. 2021 had a 20% increase, and 2022 is currently at a 24% increase, with some investigations ongoing. What this has produced is an overall increase between 2019 and 2022 of 27%, also reflecting the highs in the UN Global Report. In addition, as noted, some of the most marginalized and vulnerable groups of women and girls continue to face the highest risks, largely due to ongoing social structural processes that have largely remained unchanged. This includes, for example, Indigenous and other racialized women and girls, poor women, elderly women, women living with disabilities, rural women, women working in the sex trade, just to name a few. So why have we not witnessed more progress given all of these efforts? In part, I argue it is because many of our leaders in Canada and globally still do not recognize the severity of violence against women and girls, particularly in our part of the world, and especially the problem of femicide. Perhaps this is understandable. I remember when we first started the Canadian Femicide Observatory, our expert panel members were profoundly impacted when they recognized the number of killings that were occurring across the country. These were individuals who were working in the movement, researching in the movement, etc. Sometimes when they happen in other parts of the country, we may not be as aware. The term is still more commonly recognized in the Global South, where there are some of the highest numbers of femicide, which arguably is the reason why they have introduced femicide or feminicide in some countries. However, they have been leading in effective social change movements. This is not the case in the global north, including Canada and the United States, but we hope that that is changing gradually. Leading the way, 22 countries have already identified femicide as a violent crisis, passing specific legislations or approving reforms to their criminal codes. Again, most of these in Latin America, but with recent progress in Europe. For example, Belgium and Malta, and more recently, Croatia. This official recognition has helped to raise public and professional awareness, an issue I'll come back to in a few moments. Over time as well, this move can contribute to the prevention of future femicides by informing the development of more effective responses. These countries have introduced legislation and criminal code amendments because they recognize the need for accountability, which is the second goal for which I argue our governments must lead. This does not mean they argue in those countries for more prison or more law. It is not a form of carceral feminism, as many have argued. Rather, it means that these individuals, feminists, activists, advocates, believe that the killing of women and girls should be treated as serious as other forms of homicide, and they recognize that it is not. And while this slide focuses on perpetrator accountability, it is equally important for us to hold our governments accountable for their actions or lack of actions in responding to this form of violence. Globally, despite the rise of many innovative initiatives, we've seen struggles to effectively ratify treaties and conventions, or to implement initiatives in the way they were meant to be in practice. This is what I meant earlier when I said there has been progress on paper, at least. In Latin America, with changes in governments over the period of several years, we've seen some amendments to femicide legislation or offenses being pulled back, reducing somewhat the security of women and girls. In Europe, the Istanbul Convention, despite evidence of positive impact, has seen some recent resistance from some countries, or exiting altogether, like Turkey, again reducing the security of women and girls. And there is also the Inter-American Convention on the Prevention, Punishment, and Eradication of Violence Against Women, a convention passed in 1994 that Canada has yet to ratify almost 30 years later, despite promises in 2018 to do so. This may seem a small oversight, but I argue it is a measure of how important Canada sees the issue of femicide and violence against women and gender-based violence. And like the situation globally, we have made little effort to examine implementation processes and outcomes for those moves that have been implemented. And so some of our most marginalized and vulnerable were made at greatest risk despite this progress on paper. The result of this unfulfilled potential means that there's an ongoing culture of impunity for those who perpetrate femicide. This impunity comes from lack of action or no action, which is the case in some countries, by our governments. This can be seen the most clearly in the lack of response to the calls for justice from the inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, for whom impunity for violence is arguably the most clear in Canada. These cultural values can also be seen in how sanctions are applied differentially based on one's sex, gender, race, ethnicity, sexuality, culture, and other characteristics that lead to disparities for which data is alarmingly absent. Where we have been able to document these sanctions, our work has shown an intimacy discount. Women who were killed by current or former male partners, their deaths appear to be discounted due to their intimate relationship with their killer, despite legislation that stipulates the opposite should occur. These values can also be seen in how sanctions are applied differentially depending on where we live, across countries and world regions, and even within the same countries, such as Canada. For example, some of our work has shown that rural sanctions for femicide are often more severe or harsher than those sanctions in urban areas. So this lack of accountability in general leads to the devaluation of women and girls in society, and some women and girls in particular. Therefore, it is equally important that our governments ensure accountability by making sure that those tasked with applying the laws, judges, police, and policies and practice also recognize the seriousness of this violence, which is arguably not always the case. And we just have to pick up a paper on an almost daily basis to see some examples of this issue. As part of their work, our leaders need to make a more concerted effort to help to eradicate those negative attitudes beliefs, and stereotypes that are so resistant to change, and they continue to perpetuate and maintain violence because these attitudes are held by professionals and members of the public alike. If this doesn't occur, addressing these negative attitudes, progress on paper, but not in reality, will continue. This brings me to what I argue is the third key role of the state in femicide prevention. Every year, the lack of progress on male violence against women and girls is globally recognized by the United Nations Secretary General. This lack of progress and his note about the lack of progress preceded the pandemic, but it is a situation that we all know has been exacerbated by COVID-19. And this has had a pronounced impact on the lives of women and girls more generally, but specifically their experiences of violence. But how can our governments and our leaders move us forward with education, which I would argue is the pillar of primary prevention of gender-based violence? Here I want to highlight a quote from a 2018 report that specifically talked about the lack of progress. I'm going to look over here because I can't see the quote on that screen. So I'll read it out. Tangible progress in both protecting and saving the lives of female victims of intimate partner and family-related homicide has not been made in recent years, despite the many programs developed to eradicate violence against women and the amount of legislation adopted. Many women still find themselves alone, not only in the face of violence in their home, but also of criminal justice systems that fail to respond adequately or do not have the capacity or the knowledge to do so. So I want to unpack this statement, thinking about the government role in education. In terms of responding adequately, I argue that this is due in part to the lack of meaningful education and training, which has yet to dislodge entrenched and negative attitudes, particularly in violence in the context of intimate relationships, but also more broadly for specific groups of women and girls. This means we must move beyond the checkbox training to examine in more detail the consistency and quality of training that is being consistently delivered across the sectors responding to gender-based violence. Second, women and girls face systems that do not have the capacity to respond. For this, I argue it means that many working in these systems, they absolutely know the role played by community and sociocultural determinants of violence. They themselves, however, do not have the power or the resources to do much about it without the support of their governments. For example, how can they alone work to address sexism, poverty, discrimination, colonization? Yes, we can make small changes in how we as individuals do things, and that's vitally important. But for sustained change, we need leadership. Third, women and girls face systems that do not have the knowledge to respond, which again underscores that many may not have the necessary training, education, and awareness, often because of a lack of resources and time to do so, given the many responsibilities that frontline sectors and many sectors have responding to this type of violence. These are not blaming statements, but they are statements of reality, which have been exacerbated again by COVID. But this reality can be changed with more emphasis on consistent and quality education and training. So given the time, I'm just going to go through very quickly core areas of education, and they're on the slides here as well. Education that educates those who design legislation and policy so that they are aware of the challenges and entrenched hierarchies of worthy subjects, those who do and do not deserve attention, which often leaves the victimization of some invisible, as we know. Education that works with professionals on the ground, including ourselves, who need to be aware of entrenched and negative attitudes, beliefs, and stereotypes that we hold or others hold. Only by being aware of them can we change them. And I am continuously learning about some attitudes and beliefs that I continue to need to change. And so I think if we all acknowledge that, we would be better off. This reality can also be addressed by governments who prioritize and lead education for members of the public, of the communities in which women, girls, and their perpetrators live, that this violence is not normal, nor is it private. Rather, it is violence that affects all of us. That it is public violence with widespread and devastating impacts that reverberate in society for decades to come. And just as one example that you're aware of, if you've seen our most recent report, while this information is not tracked consistently, we did try to do so for our 5-year report. And in that 5-year period, we found that at least 868 children had lost their mothers to femicide in the past 5 years alone. Many of these children will also have lost their fathers or male guardians through suicide or incarceration. In short, this reality can be addressed by governments who prioritize and lead initiatives that can change the cultural values of the communities and societies in which we all live. Values that counteract the historical and contemporary normalization, minimization, and tolerance of various forms of violence, including that which may be perpetrated by our leaders themselves, law enforcement, and the very government institutions meant to help secure the lives of women and girls. So these 3 core responsibilities, recognition, accountability, and education, can also be better supported by research, including reliable and consistent data, which is what we at the Observatory have been doing, working at and lobbying for the past 5 years with some success. And here I want to nod to all the wonderful research that's occurring in Canada and globally to highlight these particular issues. There has been growing attention to some of these issues, particularly with respect to femicide in the past decade. This year, for example, Statistics Canada released its first report on gender-related homicides of women and girls. And while the data are limited, they align with patterns we have been identifying, and it underscores the continued need for better data. The lack of data is more problematic when it comes to groups who often remain invisible in these data, which doesn't allow us to directly confront how broader intertwined social structures, social arrangements, and our social identities continue to facilitate this violence. And these are our biggest obstacles to overcome. But our reality is this: we've traveled as far as we can in our efforts to prevent femicide and gender-based violence without beginning to address these more societal level contributors. So in concluding, I argue we need to recognize the impact of broader social forces, not just individual contributors which do get the most attention. We need to be accountable in our efforts to address the role of social structures and processes in creating a society in which gender-based violence is allowed to flourish. And finally, we need to educate our leaders, ourselves, related professionals, and our communities, because we can all learn more about the role these broader social forces play in continuing to put those at risk of gender-based violence. The security of our states and our future depends on it. And Canada can lead if we're willing to do so. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Myrna, for that insightful presentation. I think there's lots of, key points and recommendations that you've brought to our attention. And we know there's some slow movement, happening in terms of, the government leadership and recent funding announcement that was just put out, I believe, just this last week in recognition of the 16 days of activism for gender-based violence. And there's further work to do, right? The leadership of not only government, but also municipalities at all levels, the governments at all levels. And, we've seen a shift in municipalities declaring gender-based violence as an epidemic, and that's growing, which is a good sign for people to, show their commitment to change. And let's hope that more people get on board, and that we all can play a role, I think, is important, not only just governments, but each of us as individuals, as agencies. We all have a different role that we can play. So thank you for bringing all those issues to our attention, and also the lack of data. I think that's consistent for all of us in terms of whatever field that we're in, and collecting that is so important. And it's unfortunate to say that we need that to validate the need to prevent this, but because we know what's happening. We do have a couple questions from our attendees. The first one was just asking, are there any research projects currently going on or plan to evaluate the cultural norms and their contributions in femicide across Canada?
Not to my knowledge, but that doesn't mean that there aren't projects that I'm not aware of. I think, that's why I said that is probably one of our biggest challenges right now, because the ability to assess cultural norms is a big undertaking. I do know that Australia has done some really good work in this area. They've been assessing community attitudes to violence against women and gender-based violence for several years, and maybe over a decade. And they've, shown that some of the attitudes haven't changed considerably, which I think is part of why one of the things I try to emphasize in this talk is that we need to really focus on primary prevention, that aspect of public education and awareness. So attitudes that maybe underpin some of the problematic responses that lead to femicide in the end, that maybe we can combat those. And again, it's not a blaming statement. I think we all have a responsibility to challenge our own way of thinking about different issues. And I think this is one of the issues that we haven't actually probably focused enough of our primary prevention efforts on. And that's where I think that we could really, we really could use some leadership from the federal government, from provincial governments and municipalities in terms of education and awareness campaigns to help us look at that. So to my knowledge, no, but great question. And it's something that I think that we really need to dig deep into and see how we can assess that.
Great, thank you. And I know through our sessions today, we do have some of our experts that are joining us talking about some of the educational programs that they have for different sectors. So please, tune in, because I know our panel, we're going to be talking about innovative approaches to that education, and not only for men's programs and LGBTQ+ programs. So yeah, there is a long way, and we save a lot of money for prevention versus intervention. So let's hope that there's more money dedicated to that early prevention. There's another question about how do we convince the public media to name the issue correctly and not ignore the overall context?
Yeah, that's a hard question, and it's one that I used to be a reporter in my first life, and I remember talking to a student one time about this issue, and I said, well, it's really hard for them to take on these big issues, and she said, well, they do when it's a public health issue like SARS or COVID-19. They figure out how to drill down into the root causes of those sorts of issues. So why can't they do it with femicide? I think there's been some progress, and I give a nod here to, there's a number of initiatives throughout Ontario and Canada that have really started to focus on responsible media reporting. And, we try to highlight some of the good examples and some of maybe the not so good examples through our social media. And there's been quite sort of a focus on this more internationally, because I think there's a recognition now that it's media that really can play the largest role in primary prevention, in changing attitudes. And so I have noticed, some media is starting to use the term femicide. I have noticed that, more now they're using the term intimate partner violence as opposed to domestic violence. These are all things I think that are positive. And, change takes, the Chinese proverb says change takes 100 years, and we haven't reached 100 years yet, and maybe a lot of us won't be here by then. But I think we'll hopefully see more change within the media. And I've had lots of discussions with reporters, and they're really trying to be more aware. I think one of the stumbling blocks in particular with respect to femicide is some people have argued, well, it's not in the criminal code, so we can't name it. But the reality is neither is domestic violence, neither is domestic homicide. They're not criminal code offenses. So it's really just about a cultural shift. And I think there has been some change, but it's just a continuous sort of education process, and we'll continue to see some of that change.
Yeah, because they're also learning as well in terms of, if they don't know then and they're not informed, then they continue the way that they've done it. So that's a really good point. There's also a question about how can we mitigate that culture of violence is now so pervasive on social media. And that's such a huge platform for, people to reach out and giving bad messages, right? And how do we change that context of within that platform?
And that's a really good question. And it's so important because that's where people are even getting their news is on social media. I think one of the things that we've tried to do through the Canadian Femicide Observatory is there are a lot of bad messages, and we use the mute button a lot. But I think what we always do before we mute, if we know that there's really not going to be a change in this person's attitude, is we always make sure we respond to that person. Even if it's potentially a troll or someone that we know is trying to sort of engage us in an antagonistic debate, we always try to put some information out there, because our sort of assumption that there's a lot of people there in the background that are absorbing this message from this particular person. And so we respond with, some resources that they can read, with some, counteractive sort of comments that are still professional, and we try not to stoop to their level, but at least hopefully we're getting some of those people in the background. I mean, it is, it's a hard environment to be in. But at the same time, I try to remind myself that, social media has always also been really, really good for leveling the playing field for those of us who want to do primary prevention work, because it's accessible to a lot of people. So it is a balancing act. It's a very toxic environment, but focusing on that sort of more productive environment helps, sort of to balance some of the experiences that I know we all have.
Great. There's also a question just about sort of the data collection piece that we were referring to earlier. How do we get the police or judicial authorities to collect that data on gender-based violence, including hidden victims such as children?
That's such an excellent question. I could do I think 7 keynotes on the issue of data, because that's the thing that we've been looking at. I think one of the things that I feel this is again where the federal government needs to lead in terms of their data collection, and this is why I was quite happy to see Statistics Canada come out with their publication, is that in a sense, police they're not researchers, and they don't really collect the data for research. And so we have to ask ourselves, what do we want our official data to do? What do we want it to achieve? And the argument that I've made in a number of forums is that our data that's supported and funded by the federal government should be for prevention, not just administration. Like, we need to focus our data nuanced for prevention. And so if the police can be trained to collect that data, that's great. But I think there needs to be some sort of sustained collaboration across governments, law enforcement, and researchers and community organizations in terms of how do we collect that data. But having said that, the United Nations, as I mentioned, just came out with a statistical framework that identified 10 contexts or indicators that are indicative of femicide. And in the StatsCan report, which I applaud for their efforts, only 4 of the 10 were possible. And StatsCan really does have a good reputation globally in terms of their data collection. So if Statistics Canada feels they only have 4 of the 10 factors, and the ability to collect that globally is part of the issue. And I think the UN Special Rapporteur in 2015 called for femicide watches and observatories, which was in part why we started our initiative. And these initiatives exist globally, and it is pushing governments to be more accountable in terms of what they're collecting. And so again, data is a big issue because it informs prevention, and it will take time, but I think that at least there's been some progress as well. And the United Nations has helped to lead, and now it's time for the countries and the governments in those countries to sort of pay attention and try to adopt some of those changes.
Great. And then we just have one last question before we wrap up. So when we were talking about Indigenous women and girls and their invincibility, does it indicate discrimination present in the criminal mindset as well?
In the criminal mindset?
Yeah, I'm not quite sure what the question's getting at, but
can they clarify?
If you could clarify in your question. If not, then maybe we can respond after in the chat and the networking. I think that might be better. It's because we're running out of time. There's lots of comments I see from individuals as well. So thank you so much again, Myrna, for your keynote presentation, and sort of sets the stage for today and what we're going to learn from prevention and education programs and different approaches, as well as, different, the responsibility of the government, as you referred to, in terms of that investment, and how we can all play that role in terms of prevention. So thank you, and thank everybody for joining. I will now we will stop the session. We'll go to break. You'll have some time to do your networking as well. And just a reminder, when you go into the next concurrent sessions, that little arrow in the top box, it looks like a double arrow. You can make that larger so your screen is bigger for the presentations on your own, on your feed computer, and then you can click it to make it smaller. So thank you again for everybody, and we'll see you at the next concurrent session.